I'm here at the scene of the crime spree, right behind me.
Let him do that, strange.
Vice Mayor Strange, you'll address her properly.
You can kiss my foot.
Mr. Rickard, you're out of order.
FBI, we are asking you to investigate this council. Please look into this council, how they award contracts, the bid process, how they use their positions to benefit their friends and themselves, how they use their positions to attack residents and critics and neighbors and business competition. FBI, will you please look into this?
And I welcome the FBI here. If you notice, Mr. Thompson with his plea for the FBI and his watchdog group, this city runs the cleanest in this whole county. I guarantee
He was served a federal subpoena this morning.
Did receive a subpoena this morning, and we're going to cooperate 100% with the subpoena. And
Most of you who were involved up here, you gaslighted me. You tried to say I was crazy. And now we know that that's not true. And there's a lot of other issues I've been asking about as well.
So last night I was not able to finish all 27 pages of the latest motion that was just filed 2 nights ago for Judge Walker to acquit just acquit James Finch, the defendant in the Lynn Haven corruption case. And it's likely it will happen. And I'll tell you why. I said this yesterday. But prior to the trial, pre-trial, Judge Walker almost dismissed the whole thing anyway, based on what he called reckless and unprofessional and haphazard work by the investigators and the prosecutors and more stuff. But he didn't want to do that because that would have been an extraordinary step. He wanted the jury to decide. And so it went to trial. And then after the prosecutors were finished with their closing arguments and the jury went back into to deliberate, the defense filed what's known as a Rule 29, Federal Rule 29, which means told you there wasn't enough evidence to convict. And Judge Walker said to the prosecutors with the jury out of the room, you barely survived that. He wanted to give the jury a chance to decide, and the jury was deadlocked on both counts. So now here we are after the trial. So pre-trial, Judge Walker said, I really want a jury to be the judge of the facts. Before the jury decided, he really thought about it. But he said, no, I really want the jury to be the judge of the facts here. And then the jury was the judge of the facts, and they were deadlocked. So now, after the trial, after the jury had their crack at it, Judge Walker is looking at it again. And I'm going to read to you the final 10 pages of the motion filed by the Finch asking for acquittal. And there's a good chance it could happen. If it does not happen, then we're going to go to trial, looks like in July. All right. But before I get started, it is campaign season. And it is a big deal. And I want to run a few paid campaign ads. I'm telling you, they're paid campaign ads. But I do not take campaign ads from anybody who I would not like to see elected. I turned money away on this one. So let's do that. Here's one you haven't seen. We haven't talked about Panama City. Panama City is a big deal. And Doc Rowan wants your vote. Doc Rowan is running for mayor of Panama City. The city wants to spend $170 million to build a new civic center. They could have restored it for $12 million. Why are they so determined to spend more than $150 million than they should? And they want to shut down the boat ramp in the marina. If they have their way, generations of boaters and fishermen would become second-class citizens. It's time for a mayor who puts you first, rather than the big developers. Vote for Doc Rowan on or before April 18th. And of course, you know, there are 4 seats up for grabs. April 28th, less than 3 weeks in Lynn Haven. And if you want to clean up Lynn Haven, this is important. Brian Gray is running for Lynn Haven City Commission Seat 1. He wants to reform code enforcement so that everyone is treated equally for once. He rejects adopting the International Property Maintenance Code. Don't turn the city into a giant HOA. Vote for Gray on or before April 18th. And of course, the mayor's seat. You can finally return the city of Lynn Haven to the people with Judy Tinder. Judy Tinder is running for mayor of Lynn Haven. The people deserve a strong police department, a well-funded police department whose focus is to serve and protect the people equally under the law. That requires new leadership that appreciates its good officers and holds the bad apples accountable. For a strong and better police department, vote for Judy Tinder on or before April 18th. All right, let's go right to the motion, and here it is. You saw this yesterday. You saw up to page 17. Defendant Finch's renewed motion for judgment of acquittal. The judge himself, the court, can't acquit after seeing the evidence was bogus and non-existent, and after the jury could not convict because, wasn't enough there. So let's go to page 17 where we were yesterday after an hour. And here we go. This is, remember, from the Finch defense to Judge Walker saying, Your Honor, we understand you didn't dismiss the case before trial. We understand. That would have been extraordinary. And we understand that you did not grant our Rule 29 request for acquittal before the jury came back. They deserved a crack at it, and they got one. But here we are, after all that, post-trial. And this is the remaining part of their request, and they're laying out the arguments. The government presented no evidence from an undercover agent or undercover cooperating witness. Indeed, there were neither tapes nor wiretaps nor recordings. There was no testimony of a confession or other evidence by Barnes or defendant Finch. In fact, there was just the opposite: open, traceable, and visible transactions between Finch and Barnes. Aside from the alleged Sheffield Park conversation with serious racial overtones and the dubious statements inserted into the Barnes plea agreement by the government in a separate proceeding, there simply is no evidence of illegal intent or willful illegal conduct. There is further zero evidence of concealment of bribes, which have been long recognized as powerful evidence of corrupt intent. Here, the wholesale absence of concealment evidence alone is sufficient. The absence of concealment evidence. They didn't try to hide anything. It wasn't a sack of cash. It was a check that went into a business account. And that alone should be sufficient, argues the defense, to grant the renewed motion for judgment of acquittal. And then they cite case law of past examples where it has happened. But in affirming the conviction, the 11th court, so in other words, somebody was convicted and they appealed, and upon appeal, the 11th Circuit held that the nature, timing, secret recording, and routing of payments through charitable foundations and a law firm allowed for reasonable inferences of corrupt intent. In other words, in a past case, it took all that stuff. There's none of that here. In this case, there is no evidence that Finch concealed the principal loan disbursements to Barnes. The nature of the loan was legitimate. The timing was legitimate. There were no secret recordings. All payments were made via check. The memo line on 5 of the 7 checks indicated that it was part of their loan agreement. 6 of the 7 checks were deposited into Barnes's business bank accounts. All checks were written between the time Barnes was trying to relaunch his insurance business and the settling and winding down of his business affairs in late 2017, early 2018. Not a single government witness testified that the checks were intended for any other purpose than for use to support Mr. Barnes's insurance business. In fact, the government's witness admitted that the FBI did not have a forensic accountant analyze Barnes's business or personal bank accounts. The FBI agent himself testified on behalf of the prosecutors and said, "No, Your Honor, or no jury, rather, no jury. We didn't do any. After it went into his business bank account, it could have been legitimate business, but we suspect that it wasn't." What do you mean you suspect? Did you look? No, we didn't look. But you got all these forensic accountants. Yeah, but we didn't use them in this case. Okay, that's a big deal. All right, so insufficient evidence of a federal benefit. That also has to be an element that has to be met in order for Finch to be guilty. There has to be evidence of that the city took federal money and used that federal money for this, for the 17th Street ditch and stuff. The city's receipt of federal benefits is an essential element of the charges. Without it, there's no case against Finch. The court determined that the evidence and testimony presented by the government was sufficient proof of a federal benefit. Upon closer inspection, however, it becomes clear the government failed its burden. The prosecutors. The prosecutors present, whenever I say government, that's the prosecutors, presented evidence from only state-level witnesses in the trial, only state-level witnesses, that the city of Lynn Haven received federal funds. But an organization is not a beneficiary of a federal program merely because the organization receives federal funds. That's a matter of case law. You'll understand better as this goes on. All right. On the morning of 2020, March 15th, the court announced that it had received and reviewed defendant Finch's motion for judgment of acquittal and would be taking the Rule 29 motion under advisement. So after, in court on the last day of trial, when the prosecutors completed their closing arguments and the jury went back to start deliberating, Judge Walker took the first Rule 29, there's not enough evidence to convict, motion, and asking for acquittal under advisement. Then he came back in the courtroom. Jury was still gone. And he told the prosecutors, "You barely survived that, but I'm going to give the jury a crack at this." But the court also requested the parties be prepared to discuss Fisher and what quantum of proof would be considered sufficient. So he said, "I'll be back. You guys be ready to argue those two things." Following closing arguments, the court ruled on defendant's motion for judgment of acquittal, finding that the evidence related to federal benefits was sufficient because, quote, "Here, for example, we have FEMA describe what it is. Then we have the money going for a project related to an emergency center." So that ties the federal money to the project, the city project, and that's the stretch they had to make for this even to be a federal issue. The fact that this is in federal court is just unbelievable. Respectfully, the defense says, the government did not present any testimony during the trial from FEMA, NOAA, or the DOJ about a federal program's structure, operation, and purpose to fulfill the requirements of Fisher, which was factually and procedurally distinguishable as described below. So Fisher, the ruling in Fisher, which is a case, which is now state case law, here's what it determined. To determine whether an organization participating in a federal assistance program receives benefits, which is a requirement in this case, an examination must be undertaken of the program's structure, operation, and purpose. And there must be a nexus between the funds and their ultimate use to satisfy 666. Yes, that's the That's the federal statute. That's the federal bribery statute. All right. In other words, to constitutionally cabin 666 courts, in other words, in order for this particular statute, this way of charging Finch of a bribe to hold, the courts must evaluate a federal program structure, operation, and purpose to determine if the federal receipts qualify as benefits. Failure to conduct this necessary investigation violates Fisher's admonition that it is not a boundless statute that applies to virtually every state bribery or fraud case. In other words, in order to stretch this into a federal case, it has to meet certain criteria. After Fisher, it's clear that the term benefits encompasses only federal funds under sufficiently comprehensive programs. Application of this standard is to be guided by reference to a program's structure, operation, and purpose. So the question whether there exists a nexus between federal funds and the ultimate use of funds, which is required, and whether there exists a nexus between federal funds and an alleged bribe or fraud, which is not required, are independent questions. All right, so they go on citing another case, McLean, for a proposition that a nexus is required between federal funds and their ultimate use, finding that municipal government, this is what happened in Lynn Haven, municipal government pooled monies and no evidence of ultimate use of federal funds, and granting motion for judgment of acquittal based on lack of evidence. In other words, Lynn Haven didn't take the federal money and use it on that project. They pooled it with other money, and therefore it does not meet the standard. See, Fisher provides an excellent analysis of a qualifying program structure, operation, and purpose, but it is otherwise factually and procedurally distinct. In Fisher, the parties stipulated that Medicare, in the other case that sets this standard, that Medicare was a qualified assistance program. The dispute concerned whether payments made to hospitals were a benefit or a purely commercial transaction. So the Supreme Court analyzed the structure, operation, and purpose of the Medicare program to determine whether hospitals were beneficiaries. Conversely, the Supreme Court did not analyze whether the evidence sufficiently demonstrated a program structure, operation, and purpose beyond a reasonable doubt, such that the program qualified as a federal assistance program. Like here. Here, the government presented generic evidence from state-level witnesses that the city indirectly received funds from federal agencies, but failed to present evidence of the structure, operation, and purpose of the federal programs themselves. The government likewise failed to present sufficient evidence of a nexus between the funds received and their ultimate use. So the question whether FEMA, NOAA, or DOJ's pass-through funding programs constitute the requisite federal benefit cannot be left to jurors' exercise of common sense and reliance on general knowledge of FEMA, NOAA, or the DOJ's structure, operation, and purpose. Doing so would allow jurors to substitute extra record knowledge for gaps in the government's evidence, and would relieve the government of its burden of providing an essential element of the offense. Wow. At most, the government witnesses testified about the state of Florida's component and participation, but not about the federal component and participation. For instance, Joel Schubert, the city attorney before Mike White, testified that Lynn Haven received a grant through FEMA and the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program to purchase a generator for an emergency operations facility. However, Mr. Schubert gave no testimony concerning the structure, operation, and purpose of FEMA or the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Further, Schubert gave no testimony to evidence that the funds received were ultimately used to purchase the generator. The funds just as likely could have been intermingled with the city's general funds and ultimately used for some unrelated generator. We don't know, and that's important, essential. The same is true for Pamela Price's testimony. Joel Schubert also testified that the city received a grant through DOJ's Justice Assistance Program. But again, Mr. Schubert gave no testimony concerning the structure, operation, and purpose of the Justice Assistance Grant Program. He indicated he was only generally familiar with the program and thought that the city probably applied for the grant. And Schubert again gave no testimony to evidence how the funds received, if any, were ultimately used. Likewise, Cody Menesoff's testimony, I don't know how to pronounce it, so forgive me, is devoid of the requisite evidence concerning the structure, operation, and purpose of the DOJ's Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant. And lastly, Holly Edmond testified that Lynn Haven received grant assistance with a shoreline stabilization project at Kensal Park. Although Ms. Edmond provided testimony about the state application process and pass-through mechanics, she gave no testimony about NOAA's structure, operation, and purpose to determine if the federal receipts qualify as benefits. This is a big deal. I know it feels like we're getting caught up in the thick of thin things, but in this case, this is thick stuff. This has to be there for there even to be a case. In short, the court must scrutinize the actual evidence the government presented as to whether federal funds rise to the level of benefits. That may not have been established. And that's yet another reason that the defense is saying that this needs to be dismissed. The Finch needs to be acquitted. This is powerful stuff. And Judge Walker is considering it. All right, I'm going to finish this up right after this.
Is your past ruining your future? Having your record sealed or expunged wipes the slate clean, providing you with a new opportunity in life. I'm Al Saulene, your Panama City Beach lawyer. 215-0628.
Don't let back pain and neck pain get you down. Find relief at Brown Chiropractic Center on St. Andrews Boulevard in Panama City. Dr. Sherry Brown helps people heal naturally with chiropractic adjustments and deep tissue massage. Call 769-3777. All right, so a lack of evidence precludes an examination of whether any federal funds qualify as federal benefits, and thus the evidence is insufficient for any rational trier of fact, which is what a jury is, to sustain a conviction. Therefore, the court should enter a judgment of acquittal as to counts 1 and 2, the only counts. And then they cite case law again, okay? Stuff that we've been talking about. All right, this was big. Judge Walker mentioned this when he was talking to the prosecutors with the jury out of the room. Unrebutted evidence negating corrupt intent. In other words, the prosecutors never rebutted the defense in the trial. One last point is worth noting, inasmuch as it reflects the true speculative nature of what the government is asking the jury to do. As noted by the court following the closing arguments. By the court means by the judge. The defense presented the following unrebutted evidence and testimony. All right, so this is what the defense said why Finch is not guilty of this stuff. And the prosecutors did not rebut it. All right, these are the reasons that Finch is, some of the defense reasons Finch is not guilty. There is a process whereby all city projects, contracts, and resolutions were voted on and were vetted by city department heads and staff before being presented to the commissioners. The commissioners voted based on the recommendations of the staff. This is a really important page. It's page 25. The city commissioners generally approved the lowest bid, unless there was some other concern about the project itself. There was a general unanimity among the commissioners if a project or resolution that went through a bidding process was recommended by staff. All matters specifically related to Finch or one of his companies received unanimous approval after staff review and recommendation to the commissioners. Commissioner Barnes voted on Finch-related proposals and projects for years and years and years. He was a commissioner since 1996. And like he just started voting for Finch after he got the business loans. So that was another unrebutted piece of information that the jury heard. Finch's bids were accepted because his was the low bid. A large contributing factor in Finch's bids being lower than other competitors was because he was local and had the employees and equipment in place. These are big jobs. Finch worked with and offered to work with the city of Lynn Haven, not just because he was a businessman, but because he had a vested interest in doing things for the city in which he was born and lived. That was something that I learned. I knew he was from Lynn Haven, or he lived in Lynn Haven, and that was his town and that kind of stuff. But I didn't realize how committed he was to fixing that gigantic 17th Street ditch project, which was more than just a ditch. It was a gigantic ravine along the side of the east side of town, the west side of town, on the road, right by the road where people were crashing and one lady died. I didn't realize that Lynn Haven wasn't that, they didn't have enough commissioners that focused on that. And Finch loaned the money to the city, said, look, don't pay me anything till it's done. Took a year. And don't make your last payment to the bank of James Finch, because he loaned them the money at a lower interest rate, until I'm 95 years old. A 30-year mortgage. I didn't know these things. That's what they want to put him in prison for life for. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark. Finch, while he may not have a JD from Harvard, he's a pretty bright guy. These are quotes from several witnesses. Many people tell me that Finch is a genius when it comes to these projects, when it comes to business. You wouldn't believe all the very successful businessmen who went up there and said that Finch taught them how to be more productive and effective at their craft. I've seen a lot of that. And especially at what he does. Everybody says the guy is the bomb when it comes to that stuff. And not even his detractors deny that. Even the prosecutor said, yeah, but don't, that's not part of this. Finch did not influence or attempt to influence Mr. Schubert by offering to sell him a home for thousands of dollars more than Schubert was wanting to pay. All right, conclusion. The evidence here, this is what a Rule 29 is. This is what the motion is. This is when the defense says the evidence is so scant that the jury cannot give a conviction and they could only speculate about his guilt. There's no proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They can only speculate that maybe he's guilty. And that means not guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. As to even viewing all the evidence in a light most favorable to the prosecution, a reasonably minded jury must have had a reasonable doubt as to the existence of any of the essential elements of the alleged crime of conspiracy and bribery. Counts 1 and count 2. Count 1 and count 2. In this case, at least half of the jury, maybe more, concluded that the evidence of Mr. Finch's guilt was insufficient. In a renewed context, upon reflection and review of the record, the court was eminently correct, the judge, at the trial when the jury went off to deliberate after the closing arguments. The defense says, the judge, you were right that this case barely survived a Rule 29 motion at the close of the government's case, but upon further review of all the evidence, including the unrebutted evidence from the defense, which should give, quote, equal or nearly equal circumstantial support to a theory of guilt and a theory of innocence. In other words, it could go either way, and that means it must be not guilty because it's beyond a reasonable doubt. An entry of a judgment of acquittal is warranted, says the defense. And that is what Judge Walker is renewing. No telling when he'll make a judgment on this, but I would expect it probably won't take more than a week unless he's buried in another trial. All right, I want to thank these sponsors as well.
You want to look good? You want to feel good? Little John's Big and Tall is where it's at. Right across the street from Sky's Pizza Pie, 5700 North Davis Highway. You can find out more online at littlejohnsbigandtall.com. He's also a member of the iTex trading community, where your iTex dollars are welcome.
It's a hot time in Florida, and my friend Ryan can make sure your air conditioning is running at peak efficiency. He could even install a new one, built to a higher standard, American standard. Find out more at pcairrepair.com. And of course, I want to thank the Unknown Patriot. Thank you, Unknown Patriot, for your support of my efforts to bring you what you don't see on local news, for reasons we've gone over ad nauseum. End the week on that, ad nauseum. I do have a bunch of stuff to share. I'll be posting stuff over the weekend that breaks a lot of this down. And there's just so much going on right now. And I'll do my best to make sure you see all of it and understand it. All right. Thank you so much for being with me. Have a good and a safe weekend. And I will see you very, very soon.